Hopefully that's not what kicked us out. All right, looks like we're good. So let's try this again. Welcome to the August 8th SIG Auth meeting. We have a couple announcements. The person who put the HashiCorp announcement couldn't actually make the meeting. So it's just kind of an FYI. The code is here, feedback is welcome, and check that out if you're interested. The next announcement, audit events and the audit API, the advanced audit API, sorry, has been promoted to V1. That PR merged. There's a kind of related discussion going on about removing the basic auditing. And some discussions around whether this needs to follow the deprecation policy or not. My opinion is that this is more of advanced auditing going to GA as opposed to a removal of a past feature. However, the advanced auditing, even with the legacy log format, has slightly different behavior than the basic auditing. So if you have opinions on that, please chime in on that PR. Also, we have a new SIG Auth charter. This is a bit different from what we presented probably about 2 months ago originally. The steering committee kind of looked at all of the charters and sort of refactored the process a bit so that we weren't all copying and pasting slightly different versions. The new charter has a much bigger focus on the scope. And I will kind of quickly run through that here. The mission statement we came up with is that SIG Auth is responsible for the design, implementation, and maintenance of features in Kubernetes that control and protect access to the API and other core components. So that includes authentication, authorization, and also auditing and some security policy. And kind of more specifically, we own the kind of authorizer and authenticator interfaces, the audit, and a few security-related admission plugins, including node restriction, service count, pod security policy, image policy, and some others that might be coming along the lines, or coming down the pike. And also some other mechanisms for protecting things like secrets, securing the connection between the master and the nodes and other components, and ensuring that components in the cluster are running with the appropriate permissions. That's kind of our core responsibilities. This hopefully doesn't come as a surprise to anyone. If you feel like anything is left out here, we'd love to kind of hear about that and add it in. This is definitely a living document, not the be-all and end-all of the SIG. We also want to include kind of our role as advisors and consultants to other SIGs in the community. And so this is when we, I lost my screen here. Can other folks still see screen?
No, it's gone.
It's gone?
Yeah. It was just too sensitive.
It kind of looks like either Zoom or my window manager has crashed. That's all.
The link is in the agenda if you want to follow along. You can do that.
All right, sorry about that. All right, I'm going to stop sharing. If someone else wants to try sharing their screen, they seem to be having some technical difficulties here. But yeah, just to kind of finish running through the other processes, basically consulting on features that might affect or depend on the other things that we've talked about. Thanks, Jordan. And then just to explicitly call out a few things that are out of scope, general kind of security vulnerability management and reporting should still happen through the product security team. And kind of general security of Kubernetes should be handled by the appropriate SIGs for the component that we're discussing. So things like container isolation is mostly owned by SIG-Node and SIG networking. Data protection is kind of SIG storage and SIG-Node, and a few other things that are mentioned there. Excuse me. And then the rest of the charter is talking a bit about the different roles, and we basically deferred to the governance charter for that. So that's our charter that we came up with. Feedback is definitely welcome. As I mentioned, it's a living document. So, feel free to chime in or just submit a PR to date it as you think fit.
And just to also call out that the next step is kind of taking these examples and actually listing out the subprojects for these things and kind of the people who are involved in each of those areas. So we're trying to get this done as a first step, get the scope done before we started writing those out, but that will be the next step now.
Right, thanks for calling that out. So let's move on to our discussion topics. Mike, I think you might have added the first one.
Yeah, so this proposal was sent out this morning. It adds a container level service count to some of the service count token proposals. I think there's a common feature request for two containers running side by side to have different permissions. This was kind of discussed in one of Tim's talk where Tim explored subpod isolation. I'm not sure if this is the correct approach, but I see a gap in the Kubernetes feature set, and I'd be interested to see how people feel about this. Does anybody has anybody found this feature lacking in Kubernetes before? If so, is this something that we should prioritize solving?
I have seen setups where someone wanted one container to not be able to talk to the API at all, right? Where they had one kind of dedicated container that was going to manage API communication and do stuff, and then firewall that off from other containers and interact via files in a shared volume or some other mechanism. And so it was less wanting one container to have different API permissions and more like wanting one container to not have API access at all.
Mhm.
That seems pretty useful, actually.
That's possible without auto mounting of the service account token.
We don't have auto mount at the container level today.
Right. So it's possible to turn off auto mount. And
then, turn off auto mounting and then specifically mount into particular.
Yeah, which is painful.
Yeah, that is. That's true.
If you disable auto mount and set up the mounts manually, then you can accomplish even 2 separate service accounts for the different containers, right?
You can today with the projected service account token. That only will project the service account bound to the pod.
Uh-huh.
But you can generate tokens for other service accounts if you must. If you have appropriate permissions, or if you give the root service account appropriate permissions. I do think it would be useful to have potentially a container private claim or container name private claim in the token. There's a little complexity around how the volume manager gets information on which container the mount is for. I don't think there's an API for that currently, and actually those are all, it's the same mount and it's bound into many containers. So it would be a significant architectural change to how we implement that today. And then as Jordan brought up on the proposal, the kubelet would be responsible for managing n tokens per pod rather than where n is the number of containers. That's probably less concerning for me.
I would be interested to know if if segmenting by container is really what's desired here, or if segmenting different permission levels is what's desired. Because if the latter seems more broadly useful. Like if you have the same service account token, tokens for the same service account with equivalent permissions that just happen to be distinct, that are bound into the various containers in a pod, I guess that could be interesting from an auditability perspective, but it's going to be pretty hard to thread that information and make authorization decisions. And the container lifetimes are all the same basically because they're in the same pod, and like the distinct permissions seem more interesting to me.
Right. And how would that be achieved? By using audience? If you think of audience as scopes, then they're like broad permission buckets, but fine-grained is difficult, yeah.
Yeah, to do broad, you almost have to echo like some really broad name that ties to some set of permissions, and it starts to look a lot like RBAC or something. Like this token is scoped to this role, or I'm not sure how to do that without specific opinions about authorization.
Yeah, there are some extensions to like RBAC, like the team-based authorization control that seem kind of interesting, of ways to sort of take context into account. I don't know if anyone's familiar with those are RBAC extensions.
I agree that this is interesting from a auditability perspective. I am a little nervous about making it too easy to have different sets of permissions on different containers, because we've sort of decided to move forward with the pod as the security boundary. So especially as we kind of go into this sandbox world, there's kind of an expectation that if you want really vastly different permissions on the different containers, those should really be in separate pods most of the time.
Right. That was a point I brought up in the initial feature request issue, but it's good to hear that you feel that way.
Are there specific reasons that the pod would not work as the security boundary?
We can't make really if you're granting permission to a service account and that service account has different, I guess that permission is scoped depending on which container you're in, or I guess restricted. We can't make strong guarantees that this one container won't be able to gain access to the full set of permissions of the service account.
There are a lot of ways in the pod spec you can make the boundary between containers porous, so they can share memory or they can share process spaces, or depending on what volumes they share, they can get access to each other's files. There are a lot of reasons for those that let you do useful things with sidecar containers, but it makes it hard to say, like Mike said, that this token intended for container X is not going to be used by container Y.
Yeah.
Do we want to look at letting you opt out of auto mount on a per container basis?
I think that the main pain point for the auto mount stuff, or turning off auto mount today, is that the token name has a randomly generated string in it. That's not the case with projected volume.
So turning it off and then wiring it up yourself,
right, is
doable.
Yeah.
It's a little painful, but it's doable.
It at least produces a portable pod spec.
Yeah, it'd probably be good to get experience with that before we promoted it into the API.
Yeah, I'm planning on sending a PR out to move the service account admission controller over to using projected volumes or projected service account tokens this week or next week. So I'll start to play around with turning that off. And also propose a plan on how to phase that in over the next couple of releases.
Yep.
I would definitely be interested in seeing if there are ways that we can streamline the API to manually mount those service accounts through the token volume projection. And as kind of like a stepping stone to eventually disabling or even removing the auto mount feature, since I think that's, I think most pods do not need service accounts mounted.
I think you'd be surprised, but maybe I only hear from the people who use them.
Do you mean they don't need credentials?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, presumably people run things besides Kubernetes extensions on the cluster, right? So
I think it would be great. It would be great to eventually switch that default, but it's going to be hard.
Mm-hmm. Pod v2. Should we move on to kubelet TLS Bootstrap?
Yeah.
Okay, so I have proposed on the feature that we promote kubelet TLS Bootstrap to GA without promoting a dependent API, the certificates API, to GA. I am confused about the difference between GA features and GA APIs. My take on the certificates API is, while I think that the code is GA quality and it is GA stable, I am unhappy with the current shape of the API. I would like to make some changes before we promote it to GA. However, it is a dependency for a feature that is widely used today and has been in Kubernetes for almost probably multiple years at this point, and is something that we should probably move towards GA or get to GA at this point. It's kind of floundered. I think that we can commit to providing a backend that kubelet, a backend to provision certificates that kubelet will be able to use for however long until if we ever deprecate the GA kubelet TLS Bootstrap. I'm not sure if I want to commit to the API stability of certificates API right now.
Yeah, so even beta APIs have a timeline guarantee, and if our kubelet features made use of the CSR API, we wouldn't drop that inside the SKU window that we support before we had replaced it with something else of equivalent stability or better stability and waited for the kubelet to API server SKU window. So, I mean, we own both of those pieces. We're not gonna cut our own legs out from under us.
Right. The SKU window is smaller than the deprecation of a GA feature timeline.
Or the deprecation of a beta API, actually. So beta API v1 comes out the next release. If the kubelet is depending on the beta API, you can't remove that until 2 releases. So the old kubelets are outside the SKU window.
Okay.
So I don't think there are particular concerns that we would try to do something that would cause problems. It's more just kind of a process question. Like, can a feature be called GA if it is built on top of a beta API? So.
We've done this internally in the kubelet. For instance, I think the CRI is still considered alpha. But that's a little different since those are components that are shipped together on a single node. You're more likely to end up with skew across nodes to masters.
Yeah. What about the auto approval bits? Right now, that's client only. Are those at a point where we think they are reasonable to call
so.
GA? Okay. I suppose they're still optional. Like we don't grant those permissions to anything out of the box. So it's up to whoever's setting up the cluster to decide if they're going to use these auto approvers. So they're certainly free to use alternate approval mechanisms. So that seems reasonable.
The controller can also be turned off.
That's true. This may be more of a question for the CSR API, but I saw something recently about like wanting to be able to interact with the request. So the request comes in for X, but you want to approve it conditionally and kind of tweak what's actually going to be issued. Is that the kind of thing that you're talking about, like not being quite satisfied with the API?
Yeah, that's one issue.
Okay.
The other issue that was observed with the Kelsey's container certificate init thing is that in order to build the CSR, you need really broad read permission on the API. And that was being granted to init containers.
To build the CSR?
To make sure that you have, all the services that you're behind and stuff like that. To make sure that you get the right SANs. What it did was it was a generic init container. You didn't write any configuration at all. You just put it in there and it would request a CSR for everything that it sat behind. That thing required a lot of read access and was doing a bunch of lists on the API across.
Yeah, that seems like less of an issue with the CSR API and more an issue of how that thing was requesting.
I'm not sure about that. So what I would like to see is to have the allowed usage fields go away, and replace it with something like a profile or a context, where you request a certificate with a specific profile and you send a very slim CSR. In that model, suppose the signer supports a profile called service backend. The signer sees a CSR for the profile service backend with a signed public key. It knows what pod made the request because that information is available in the CSR object. We forward user info there. It then goes and looks up what the pod is sitting behind and fills in those SANs. So it all is kind of related.
Yeah, there's definitely value there. I think some of those things could be built on top of the CSR API just to have separation of concerns. But
yeah, that's possible too.
So like the ability of a pod to say, I want a serving cert that is valid for the services pointing at me. Like that's a reasonable thing to want. And so you can express that and have a component whose job it is to monitor such requests, figure out what services map to it, and then interact with the CSR API to produce those certificates. That seems like a distinct responsibility, but
it can't. There's no way for it to generate the CSR unless you replace the signer. So the signer needs to change because the CSR is immutable after it's created, unless you also want the thing that's watching to plumb the private key down to the pod once it's done. I think the crux is in the model where the pod generates the private key, that CSR is immutable, and the signer is not flexible.
This topic kind of came up in Spiffy, where we were talking about the purpose of a CSR and specifically the purpose of binding the key to the common name and the SANs in the CSR. And a lot of like the security rationale for having that cryptographically bound goes back to lots of like manual PKI use cases that don't apply that well to this kind of use case. So I would be in favor of a model where we treat the CSR as just like the public key and doesn't necessarily need to have any names in it. And the names that are being requested are a separate field on the CSR, on the certificate request object. And that way you could have like a admission controller or like a mutating webhook admission controller that did things like change the names to match the serving services or things like that.
I mean, CSR as a vehicle for public keys is kind of the minimum thing you could use it for. And realistically, you can already do that with at the point where you sign stuff. Like, you can ignore what it asks for and give it a cert for whatever, and just use the public keys that were in the CSR.
But not with our signer, I think is the main difference.
But the signer isn't API, right? Like, we have the ability to adjust what we do with signing, especially if the API expands to take directives that go to the signer.
So it is not an API that you either get back a certificate with the SANs you requested in the CSR and the allowed usages you requested in the object, the spec, and you either get denied or a certificate is never provisioned, or you get a certificate back with that is what you want. Because
I mean, we already, like, the signing profiles we have already will omit things that are in the CSRs. So one of the issues that someone opened, I requested this special OID arc, and I got a cert back that didn't include it, right? Like, there's no guarantee that the cert you get back has everything you asked for today. It just happens to be that what most people ask for and the things that the kubelet asks for are not fancy things.
If we just did one thing, which was pull the names out of the CSR blob out into a field like the usages are, then you could do a flow where you have a admission controller or a mutating admission controller that saw a request from a pod, swapped in the services names. You could have then an approver that validated that requests from certificate requests from a certain pod only had names that matched up with services that pointed that pod, and then the signer would just look at the names. It seems like we're almost there for that kind of flow.
Anyway, so I agree that CSR API probably isn't ready to promote to V1. I don't have a problem calling the client bootstrap and rotation and the server bootstrap and rotation stable. Both have been around for a while and used, and we intend to continue to support them even if the backend that it's built on evolves.
I don't think there's any indication outside of docs that this feature is a beta feature. It might be in one doc.
Yeah.
That's what I was going to ask is what are the actual implications of this going to GA? Is it just a documentation change or?
I think so.
I think so.
Okay.
All right. So it sounds like we're in favor.
Yeah. Are you specifically talking about the client bootstrap and rotation? Server just hit beta.
No rotation, just the TLS bootstrap.
Yeah, okay. Is that accurate?
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. Anything else to talk about, or should we get 20 minutes back?
We could restart the meeting a few more times.
Actually, quick question. So on the KMS provider for Vault, are are we going to be making any kind of announcement on that, or sort of what's going to come out of sort of this meeting with regards to that?
Are either KK or Maya here? I think that there's a bunch of security conferences going on, so people are out, but KK was coordinating with Maya last I checked. I don't have any information for you, but I would definitely sync up with one of them.
Cool, sounds good.
Yeah, he's the one who put the announcement here, but wasn't able to make the meeting. So yeah, I don't know the answer to that either.
Got it, sounds good. Thanks so much.
Anyone else? Going once? Going twice? All right, I guess that's a wrap. Thanks all. See you in 2 weeks.